The highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, winding through the vast emptiness of the countryside. Jake had been driving for hours, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few minutes, as if expecting to see something. He'd left his parents' house late, the conversation having turned sour after too many drinks. The radio had lost its signal ages ago, leaving him with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of loose gravel under the tires. It was the kind of night where the darkness felt alive, pressing against the car windows as if eager to seep in. The full moon was barely visible, shrouded by thick clouds, casting long, skeletal shadows over the road. Jake's headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating the stretch of asphalt ahead and the dense woods that bordered it. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the road. Jake's heart lurched as he slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly as it came to a stop. He squinted through the windshield. It was a man, standing dead center, dressed in a tattered coat, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't move, didn't react to the blinding headlights glaring at him. Jake hesitated, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. The man raised his hand slowly, waving it in an almost lazy, unbothered manner, as if he had all the time in the world. Jake's gut churned with unease. Picking up a hitchhiker was the last thing he wanted, especially in the middle of nowhere. But leaving someone out here felt wrong too. He rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, you okay?" he called out. The man didn't respond, just kept his hand raised in that slow, languid wave. "Do you need a ride?" Jake asked, his voice a bit sharper this time. The man finally lowered his hand, stepping closer. Jake felt a chill creep down his spine. There was something off about this guy. As he drew nearer, the headlights illuminated his face. A pale, expressionless mask with eyes that seemed empty, devoid of any light or life. Without a word, the man opened the passenger door and climbed in. Jake swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. He glanced at the man, who was now staring straight ahead, his hands resting limply on his lap. "Where are you headed?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man turned his head slowly, meeting Jake's gaze. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Just drive," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jake nodded, putting the car back into gear. He drove in silence, the tension in the car thickening with every passing mile. The man's presence felt wrong, as if he didn't quite belong, like a shadow that had slipped out of the darkness and into the real world. They drove for what felt like an eternity, the silence oppressive. Jake's nerves were on edge. He stole glances at his passenger, but the man remained still, staring blankly ahead. The temperature inside the car seemed to drop, a biting cold that seeped into Jake's bones. He shivered, cranking up the heat, but it did little to warm him. Out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw the man's lips move, barely parting as he whispered something. "Did you say something?" Jake asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man's head snapped towards him with unnatural speed, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked, his voice a hollow echo. Jake forced a laugh, though it sounded shaky even to his ears. "Not really," he replied, gripping the wheel tighter. "Why do you ask?" The man's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was thin, almost predatory. "You should," he said simply. The words sent a shiver down Jake's spine. He pressed harder on the gas, eager to put distance between himself and this stranger. The road seemed endless, the dark woods pressing in closer as if trying to swallow them whole. Then, without warning, the man started laughing. It was a low, guttural sound, like dry leaves scraping against stone. It grew louder, filling the car, echoing off the walls, making Jake's skin crawl. He glanced at the man in horror. His face was twisted into a grotesque grin, eyes wide and unblinking, the laughter pouring out of him like a broken record. "Stop it!" Jake shouted, but the man didn't stop. The laughter continued, growing louder, more manic. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. "Get out!" Jake yelled, turning to face the man. But the passenger seat was empty. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around, his mind struggling to make sense of what just happened. The door hadn't opened, and there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Jake's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He fumbled to put the car in gear, desperate to get away from this place. He sped off, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The woods seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing against the car like a living thing. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The man was sitting in the back seat, staring at him with those empty, soulless eyes. Jake's scream caught in his throat as the man leaned forward, his cold breath brushing against Jake's ear. "You can't escape," he whispered. Jake swerved violently, the car veering off the road and crashing into a ditch. The impact jolted him forward, the seatbelt cutting into his chest. Pain shot through his ribs, but he didn't care. He scrambled out of the car, stumbling into the cold night air. He turned back to the car, expecting to see the man getting out, but the back seat was empty. The passenger door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. Jake's breath came in panicked gasps, his eyes darting around the darkness. And then he saw him. The man stood at the edge of the woods, his face hidden in shadow, but Jake could feel his gaze piercing and cold. The man raised his hand once more, giving that slow, lazy wave. Jake didn't wait. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the gravel, the sound of his own heartbeat roaring in his ears. He could still feel the man's eyes on him, watching him, laughing at him. The road stretched on, but he didn't dare look back. He knew what he would see. The man, standing in the middle of the road, that eerie smile on his face, waving goodbye. Or was it hello? The night was dense, a black sheet stretching across the empty stretch of highway. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white in the dim light of her dashboard. The digital clock blinked 2:13 a.m. The loneliness of the road gnawed at her. She hadn't seen another car for miles, just the endless dark asphalt vanishing into the shadows ahead. She'd taken this route before, a shortcut through the countryside to get home from her late shift at the diner. The regular route was longer, winding through small towns, but tonight, Sarah wanted to get home as quickly as possible. She had an uneasy feeling, a prickling at the back of her neck, as if something was watching her from the depths of the forest lining the road. The radio had fizzled out a while back, leaving her with only the rumbling sound of her tires on the pavement. She fiddled with it, hoping to catch a station, but only static hissed back at her. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she gave up and rolled down the window instead. The cold night air rushed in, bringing with it the faint scent of pine and something else, something metallic. The road ahead was empty, but then her headlights caught a glimpse of movement. A figure standing at the side of the road, waving frantically. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts told her to keep driving, but something made her slow down. She squinted, trying to make out the figure as she drew closer. It was a young woman, dressed in a pale, tattered dress, her hair a tangled mess. Her face was a mask of panic and desperation. Sarah hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake pedal. She couldn't just leave this girl out here. She pulled over, the car rolling to a stop a few feet away from the figure. The girl approached the window, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You have to help me. He's coming." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Who's coming?" she asked, glancing nervously at the dark woods. The girl didn't answer, just kept looking back over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone emerge from the darkness. "Please," she repeated. "He's coming. I need to get away." Without thinking, Sarah unlocked the door. "Get in," she said, and the girl scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut behind her. Sarah hit the gas, the car speeding away from the spot where the girl had stood. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. After a few moments of silence, Sarah stole a glance at the girl. She was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched at the fabric of her dress. "What happened?" Sarah asked. "Who's after you?" The girl swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously. "I don't know what he is," she whispered, "but he's been following me. I've been running for hours." Sarah felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She wanted to ask more, but the girl's terror was palpable, and it made her own fear rise in her throat like bile. The road seemed endless, the darkness outside the car pressing in closer, as if trying to suffocate them. Suddenly, the girl's head snapped to the window. "There!" she screamed, pointing into the woods. Sarah glanced out, her heart pounding. For a split second, she saw a shape moving between the trees. Tall, impossibly thin, and fast. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the night. "What the hell was that?" she muttered, pressing harder on the gas. The girl didn't respond. She was staring straight ahead now, her eyes wide with fear. "He's getting closer," she whispered. The car sped down the highway, the engine roaring as Sarah pushed it to its limits. The feeling of being chased, of something gaining on them, filled the air. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shape from the woods behind them. But the road was empty. Then, without warning, the car jolted violently, as if something had struck it from behind. Sarah fought to keep control, the wheel jerking in her hands. She heard a sound, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the entire car. Her breath hitched in her throat. The girl screamed, her hands flying to her ears. "He's here!" she cried. "He's here!" Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the road ahead, the asphalt blurring as tears filled her eyes. The car shuddered again, a heavy thump against the trunk. She could hear it now, the scratching, like nails dragging across metal. "What is it?" Sarah shouted, panic flooding her voice. The girl turned to her, her face twisted in terror. "He wants me," she whispered. "He's come for me." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered once and then went out, plunging them into complete darkness. The sudden silence was deafening. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to restart the engine. It whined but refused to turn over. "No, no, no," she muttered, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. The girl's eyes were fixed on the rear window, her face pale as a ghost. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah forced herself to turn around. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, a shape emerged from the shadows, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the taillights. It was tall, its limbs impossibly long, its head cocked to the side as if it was studying them. The girl's voice was a broken sob. "Please," she begged, "don't let him take me." The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. As it drew nearer, Sarah could make out its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its head was smooth, featureless, a blank canvas of pale skin. Yet, she could feel its eyes on her, cold and piercing. In a panic, Sarah yanked open the car door and grabbed the girl's hand. "Run!" she screamed, pulling her out of the car. They sprinted down the road, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. But it was no use. The figure was behind them, moving faster than seemed possible. The girl stumbled, her hands slipping from Sarah's grasp. She fell to the ground, looking up at Sarah with eyes full of tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Before Sarah could react, the figure was upon the girl. She let out a scream that was abruptly cut off, her body going limp as the figure dragged her into the darkness. Sarah ran, her legs burning, her lungs screaming for air. She didn't stop until she saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. She waved her arms frantically, collapsing onto the road as a truck screeched to a halt in front of her. The driver jumped out, rushing to her side. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Sarah looked back down the road, but it was empty. There was no sign of the girl or the figure. It was as if they had never been there. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a choked sob. The driver helped her to her feet. "Come on, let's get you out of here," he said gently. He led her to his truck, but as she climbed in, she glanced back one last time. Far down the road, just at the edge of the light, she saw a figure standing there, its head cocked to the side, waving slowly, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness once more. The clock on the dashboard blinked 12:45 a.m. as Tom and Lisa drove down the winding, empty highway. They had spent the day hiking in the mountains, and now they were exhausted, craving the comfort of their warm beds. The road was completely deserted, the only light coming from their car's headlights cutting through the dense fog that had settled in. "I told you we should have left earlier," Lisa muttered, peering into the dark woods lining the road. Tom chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Relax. We're only an hour away from home. It's just a bit of fog." Lisa didn't respond. She was gripping the door handle, her eyes darting back and forth as if she was expecting something to jump out at them. Tom noticed her unease and tried to make conversation, but she stayed quiet, her face pale. As they rounded a sharp curve, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Tom slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt just inches away from the figure. It was a man, his clothes dirty and torn, his face obscured by a hood. He was standing completely still, staring at them. Tom's heart raced. "What the hell is this guy doing out here?" he muttered. "Don't stop," Lisa hissed. "Just go around him." Tom hesitated. The man hadn't moved. He was just standing there, blocking their path, as if daring them to try and pass. Tom revved the engine, hoping the sound would scare the man off, but he didn't budge. Tom took a deep breath, deciding to drive around. He carefully pulled to the left, keeping his eyes on the figure as he passed. As they edged by, the man slowly turned his head, his face coming into view. Tom's blood ran cold. The man's eyes were pure white, with no pupils, staring straight at them. His lips twisted into a slow, eerie smile. Lisa screamed, grabbing Tom's arm. Go! Go now! Tom hit the gas, the tires screeching as they sped away. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man still standing there, but he was gone. The road behind them was empty, shrouded in fog. What the hell was that? Tom shouted, his voice shaking. Lisa was crying now, her hands covering her face. I don't know. Just keep driving. Don't stop. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension in the car palpable. Tom's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the man following them. Then a strange noise filled the car, a scratching sound like nails on metal. Lisa slowly turned her head, looking out her window. Her eyes widened in terror. He's outside the window, she whispered. Tom's heart stopped. That's impossible, he said. We're going 60 miles an hour. But the scratching continued, louder now, as if whatever was making the noise was trying to get in. Tom glanced over, and for a split second, he saw the man's face pressed against the glass, his white eyes staring in, the same twisted smile on his lips. Tom swerved, nearly running off the road. The figure disappeared, and the scratching stopped. He slammed on the brakes, coming to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. What are you doing? Lisa screamed. Don't stop! Tom was breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. I can't. He was right there. Lisa grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. We need to get out of here. Now. Tom floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. They sped down the highway, the fog seeming to close in around them. Tom could barely see a few feet ahead. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. And then, the car suddenly lost power. The engine sputtered and died, the headlights flickering off. They were plunged into complete darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their heavy breathing. Tom tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. He swore under his breath, pounding the steering wheel in frustration. No, 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 no. This can't be happening. Lisa was shaking, tears streaming down her face. He's coming. I can feel it. Tom looked around, but the fog was too thick. He couldn't see anything. He tried the ignition again, and this time the engine roared to life. He let out a relieved sigh and put the car in drive. Just as he was about to hit the gas, something slammed into the side of the car with a loud thud. Lisa screamed, her hands flying to her mouth. Tom looked over, and there, staring in through the window, was the man with the white eyes. He was grinning, his face pressed against the glass, his hands scratching at the window. The noise was deafening, the screeching sound piercing their ears. Go! Lisa screamed. Drive! Tom hit the gas, the car jolting forward. He swerved back onto the road, the figure disappearing into the fog behind them. They sped down the highway, the speedometer climbing higher and higher. Tom didn't care how fast they were going. He just wanted to get away. They drove for miles, not saying a word. The only sound, the roar of the engine and the thumping of their hearts. Finally, they saw the lights of a small town in the distance. Tom let out a shaky breath, easing off the gas as they approached civilization. Did we lose him? Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom nodded, his hands still trembling. I think so. They pulled into a gas station on the edge of town. Tom turned off the engine and looked over at Lisa. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. He reached out to touch her hand, but she flinched away, staring at something behind him. Tom slowly turned his head, his heart sinking. In the side mirror, he saw the reflection of the man with the white eyes standing right behind the car, that same twisted smile on his face. Tom didn't think. He started the car and floored it, speeding out of the gas station, not caring about the red lights or the cars honking at him. He drove straight through the town, not stopping until they reached the safety of their own driveway. They bolted out of the car, running inside and locking all the doors. They didn't speak, just sat on the floor, clutching each other, trembling with fear. They stayed like that for hours. The image of those white eyes burned into their minds. The next morning, they finally mustered the courage to look outside. The car was still there, parked in the driveway. Everything seemed normal in the light of day. But when Tom went to check the car, his blood ran cold. Scratched into the driver's side door, deep and jagged, were the words, "I'll be waiting." The smile on the man's face flashed through his mind, and he knew this wasn't over. He and Lisa weren't safe. They'd disturbed something that night, something that wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. It was a cold autumn night when David found himself driving down a desolate country road. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the twisted branches of the trees that lined the road. His GPS had stopped working hours ago, and he was hopelessly lost. The flickering gaslight on his dashboard warned him that he was running low on fuel. He hadn't seen another car or a house in miles. David squinted at the road, trying to make out any signs of civilization. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught the glint of something in the distance. A small, old-fashioned gas station, seemingly abandoned, sat on the side of the road. The flickering neon sign read, "Open 24 hours." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. He pulled up to the lone pump, the gravel crunching under his tires. The station looked like it was straight out of the 1950s, with rusted metal signs advertising gasoline and faded posters of old soda brands. The place was eerily quiet. He stepped out of the car and shivered as a cold breeze whipped through the air. David approached the pump and picked up the nozzle. He was about to start filling his tank when he noticed something strange. The pump handle was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. He pulled it back and looked around. The entire area felt wrong, as if it were frozen in time. He glanced at the small shop attached to the station. It was dimly lit, but he could see someone moving behind the counter. David decided to go inside and pay first, hoping to get directions as well. As he entered, a small bell above the door chimed, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. Behind the counter stood an old man with pale, wrinkled skin. He wore a tattered uniform, his eyes sunken and dark as if he hadn't slept in years. The old man's face was devoid of emotion as he watched David approach. "Evening," David said, trying to sound casual. "I'm just getting some gas. Also, I'm lost. Could you tell me how to get back to the main highway?" The old man didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at David, unblinking. Then, in a raspy voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in decades, he said, "You shouldn't be here." David frowned. "I'm sorry, what?" The old man leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "It's not safe out there at night. The road, it's different after dark." David chuckled nervously. "Well, I just need to fill up and get on my way. If you could just tell me how to get back to the highway, I'd appreciate it." The old man's eyes darted to the door as if expecting someone or something to walk in. He hesitated before muttering, "Follow the road. Don't stop, no matter what you see. And if you hear something calling your name, do not look back." David felt a chill run down his spine. He paid quickly, eager to get out of there. As he turned to leave, he noticed a newspaper lying on the counter. The headline made his blood run cold. "Mysterious disappearances on Old Hollow Road. Missing travelers last seen at local gas station." The paper was dated 1963. David's heart raced as he rushed back to his car. He shoved the nozzle into his tank, his hands trembling. The gas poured slowly, the numbers ticking up at an agonizing pace. He glanced back at the shop. The old man was still there, watching him intently through the window, his face expressionless. Suddenly, the lights of the gas station flickered and went out. The area was plunged into darkness. David's heart pounded in his chest. He turned to look at the pump, and in the dim moonlight, he saw something moving in the darkness at the edge of the forest. It looked like a figure, a tall, thin silhouette. It was standing perfectly still, watching him. David's breathing grew rapid. He pulled the nozzle out of the tank, spilling gas in his panic. He jumped into his car, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and he sped away from the gas station, gravel flying behind him. As he drove, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. The road stretched out before him, twisting and turning through the dense forest. He pushed down on the accelerator, wanting to put as much distance as possible between him and that gas station. Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered. The engine sputtered as if it were about to die. David cursed, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. The car slowed, and he struggled to keep it going. That's when he saw it. A shadow in the middle of the road, standing directly in his path. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. His heart nearly stopped when he realized what he was looking at. It was the same figure he had seen at the gas station, tall and thin, its face hidden in the darkness. It slowly raised an arm and pointed directly at him. David felt a wave of dread wash over him, freezing him in place. Then he heard it. A voice, faint and distant, whispering his name. David! He whipped his head around, looking in all directions. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. David! Come here! It was coming from behind him, from the back seat of the car. David's blood ran cold. He didn't dare turn around. The whisper was so close now, it felt like someone was breathing down his neck. David, look at me! With a strangled cry, David threw the car into reverse, backing away from the figure. He spun the wheel, turning the car around and floored the gas pedal. The engine roared as he sped down the road, not daring to look back. He drove like a madman, the trees blurring past him. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of his own ragged breathing. He didn't stop until he saw the lights of a small diner up ahead, a beacon of hope in the darkness. David pulled into the parking lot and stumbled out of the car, collapsing on the pavement. He was shaking, his heart racing. He looked around, but the road was empty. The figure was gone. He staggered into the diner, the warmth and light enveloping him. The waitress behind the counter looked up, surprised. "Are you okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." David tried to catch his breath, his eyes darting around the room. He realized he was surrounded by people, normal people, chatting and eating as if nothing was wrong. He let out a shaky laugh, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. But then he saw it. In the corner booth, a man was sitting alone, wearing a tattered uniform, his pale eyes staring straight at David. He smiled, a slow, twisted smile. David's blood turned to ice. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing in his ears. "I told you not to look back." Nathan was driving through a remote stretch of highway late at night. The road was empty, stretching out endlessly into the darkness. He was exhausted, the kind of tiredness that seeps into your bones, but he was determined to make it home. It had been a long day, and the isolation of the road was beginning to wear on him. He turned up the radio, but only static crackled through the speakers. With a sigh, he switched it off, leaving only the hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the tires as his soundtrack. As he rounded a bend, Nathan spotted something unusual up ahead. At first, he thought it was an animal on the side of the road, but as he got closer, he realized it was a car. It was parked haphazardly, half on the road and half off, its hazard lights blinking weakly. He slowed down, his headlights illuminating the vehicle. The car looked old, its paint chipped and peeling. The driver's door was wide open, but there was no one inside. Nathan hesitated. The logical part of his mind told him to keep driving, but another part, the part that couldn't ignore a potential person in need, forced him to pull over. He rolled down his window, peering into the darkness. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called out. Silence. The night seemed to grow heavier around him, the shadows stretching out like claws. He debated with himself for a moment before grabbing his flashlight from the glove compartment. Stepping out of his car, he felt the chill of the night air prick at his skin. He shone the beam of light into the car. The inside was a mess. Papers were strewn everywhere, and the passenger seat was soaked with some kind of dark liquid. His stomach twisted at the sight. "Hello?" he called again, louder this time. "Are you okay?" Still no response. He stepped back, shining the light around the area. The road was deserted, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. He took a deep breath, about to head back to his car, when he heard it. A faint sound, like whispering. It was so quiet he thought he imagined it at first, but then it came again, a low murmur carried on the wind. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating the edge of the forest that bordered the road. The whispering stopped abruptly, and Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. He slowly backed away, turning toward his car when he heard a loud thud from the trunk of the abandoned vehicle. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The thud came again, followed by a muffled scraping sound. He crept closer, every instinct screaming at him to get back in his car and leave, but his curiosity won out. He circled to the back of the vehicle, his hand trembling as he reached for the trunk latch. With a deep breath, he popped it open. The flashlight beam landed on the contents of the trunk, and Nathan stumbled back, horrified. Inside was a man, gagged and bound, his eyes wide with terror. The man's clothes were torn, his face bruised and bloodied. He struggled against the bindings, trying to scream through the gag. Nathan quickly reached in, trying to untie him. "Hold on, I'll get you out of here." As he worked on the ropes, the man's eyes widened even further, and he started shaking his head frantically. Nathan paused, confused. The man was trying to say something, but the gag muffled his words. "What is it?" Nathan asked. "I'm helping you." The man's eyes darted behind Nathan, and that's when he felt it. A cold breath on the back of his neck. Nathan spun around, flashlight swinging wildly. The beam landed on a figure standing just a few feet away. It was a woman, her clothes soaked as if she had been standing in the rain, though the night was dry. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands over her face, obscuring her features. She stood unnaturally still, like a statue. "Who are you?" Nathan stammered, his voice shaking. "Did you do this?" The woman didn't respond. Slowly, she lifted her head, revealing her face. Nathan felt his blood run cold. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark holes that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, teeth stained with blood. She took a step forward, and Nathan stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The bound man in the trunk let out a muffled scream, thrashing wildly. Nathan's survival instincts finally kicked in, and he turned to run, bolting back toward his car. He could hear her footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, as if she knew he couldn't escape. He threw himself into his car, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands fumbled as he tried to start the engine. It roared to life, but just as he was about to throw the car into gear, she appeared in front of him. She was standing right in front of the car, her face pressed against the windshield, those dark, empty sockets staring directly at him. Her mouth opened, and he heard her voice inside his head, whispering, "You shouldn't have stopped." Nathan screamed, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, but as it did, she vanished. The car sped down the highway, and he didn't look back. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white. He drove for what felt like hours until he finally saw the lights of a small town up ahead. He pulled into a gas station, parking under the bright lights. He was shaking, drenched in sweat. He looked around, but there was no sign of the woman or the abandoned car. Nathan stumbled out of his vehicle and into the gas station's convenience store. The cashier looked up, startled by his disheveled appearance. "Hey, are you okay?" the cashier asked. Nathan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just nodded, making his way to the bathroom. He splashed water on his face, trying to calm his racing heart. As he looked up at the mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Written in the condensation on the glass were the words, "I'm still watching you." He spun around, but the bathroom was empty. He backed out of the room slowly, heart pounding in his chest. He rushed back to his car, jumped in, and drove straight through the night, not daring to stop until he reached the safety of his home. When he finally got there, he locked every door and window, double-checking each one. He sat in his living room, lights on, clutching a kitchen knife as if it could protect him. But even in the bright light of his home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. And then, just as he was about to convince himself it was all in his head, he heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside his window. "I'm still here, Nathan." Jake was heading home after a late-night shift, the empty stretch of country road illuminated only by his car's headlights. The clock read 1:35 a.m., and the radio played softly in the background, but he barely heard it over his own thoughts. The road ahead was quiet, with no other cars in sight. It was the perfect time for a peaceful drive, or so he thought. As Jake rounded a bend, his headlights caught a flash of something on the side of the road. He slowed down, squinting into the darkness. There, standing at the edge of the asphalt, was a figure. It looked like a woman, dressed in a long white gown that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her hair hung loosely over her face, and she was staring down the road, motionless. Jake felt a chill creep up his spine. He knew stories of hitchhikers, of ghosts seen on lonely highways, but he brushed the thought aside. This was just a person, maybe in need of help. Against his better judgment, he pulled over and rolled down the passenger window slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She continued to stare straight ahead, as if she hadn't noticed him at all. Her stillness was unnerving. Jake leaned closer, trying to get a better look at her face, but the hair obscured it completely. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" he asked, louder this time. Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Her movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes were sunken with dark circles surrounding them. When she opened her mouth to speak, no words came out, just a soft, gurgling sound. Jake's instincts screamed at him to drive away, but his body was frozen in place. He couldn't look away from her face, from the hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Finally, she took a slow, shuffling step toward the car. The spell broke, and Jake's hands flew to the steering wheel. He put the car in gear, tires screeching as he sped off. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there, but she was gone. The road behind him was empty, as if she had never been there at all. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. He tried to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and focused on the road ahead. He was only a few miles from home now. He turned the radio up, trying to drown out the fear still lingering in the back of his mind. Just as he was beginning to relax, a sound broke through the music. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. A slow, dragging noise like something scraping against metal. Jake's eyes darted to the side mirror. He saw nothing. The sound continued, grating on his nerves. He realized it was coming from the roof of his car. His heart pounded in his chest. He glanced up, expecting to see something pressing against the ceiling, but it looked normal. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like nails dragging across the metal. Jake slammed his foot on the gas, his car lurching forward as he sped down the road. "Please, just let me get home," he muttered under his breath. Sir, the noise stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. He dared a look in the rearview mirror again, and his blood ran cold. The woman was sitting in the back seat. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her hollow eyes met his in the reflection. She smiled, her lips stretching impossibly wide, revealing a row of jagged, rotting teeth. Jake screamed, swerving the car violently. He looked over his shoulder, but the back seat was empty. He was breathing heavily, his vision blurry with tears of fear. He glanced back at the road just in time to see the curve he was about to miss. He jerked the wheel, narrowly avoiding a crash. He forced himself to keep his eyes on the road, no matter how badly he wanted to check the back seat again. After what felt like an eternity, he saw the familiar turnoff to his driveway. He sped into it, gravel crunching under his tires as he slammed on the brakes. He didn't waste any time. He jumped out of the car, not even bothering to close the door behind him. He sprinted up to his house, fumbling with his keys as he tried to unlock the door. He burst inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against it, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his ears. He felt safer inside, the bright lights of his hallway a stark contrast to the dark road outside. He pressed his back against the door, trying to calm down. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The door rattled behind him as if something had slammed against it. Jake jumped away, staring at the door in horror. The banging continued, loud and relentless, as if something was trying to break in. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening. He held his breath, listening intently. He heard a faint scraping, just like before, but this time it was coming from inside the house. It was coming from upstairs. Jake's legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to move. He grabbed a kitchen knife, the only thing he could think of as a weapon, and slowly made his way up the stairs. The sound grew louder, coming from the hallway just outside his bedroom. He crept closer, every step feeling like an eternity. When he reached the top of the stairs, he saw her, the woman in white. She was standing in the hallway, her back to him, facing his bedroom door. The scraping sound was her nails dragging across the wood of the door. She turned slowly, her head twisting around before her body followed. She grinned at him, that same impossibly wide smile. Jake didn't think. He just ran. He turned and bolted down the stairs, racing toward the front door. He could hear her behind him, the sound of her bare feet slapping against the floor, gaining on him. He reached the door, flinging it open, and sprinted outside into the night. He ran until he couldn't run anymore, collapsing on the gravel road, gasping for breath. He looked back at his house, expecting to see her standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. The house was dark, quiet, as if no one had been there at all. Jake never went back to that house. He never drove down that road again. He moved to a new city, trying to put as much distance between himself and whatever he had seen that night. But every once in a while, when he's driving alone at night, he catches a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A flash of white, a wide, toothy smile, and he knows she's still out there waiting for him. Miles was driving down an old, winding country road late at night. His only company, the soft hum of his car's engine, and the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. He hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour, and his eyes felt heavy as he struggled to keep awake. He was close to home, only a few miles left, when his headlights illuminated something unusual on the side of the road. A parked car, abandoned, with its door hanging wide open. Slowing down, Miles tried to peer into the darkness, wondering if someone needed help. The car looked old and battered, its paint chipped and rusted. Something about it felt wrong, but Miles told himself he was just being paranoid. He almost continued driving, but then noticed a faint, flickering light coming from the nearby trees. Curiosity and a nagging sense of responsibility got the best of him. He pulled over, grabbed his flashlight, and made his way toward the trees, where the light continued to flicker. He called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" No response came, but he thought he heard a faint rustling deeper into the woods. Against his better judgment, Miles ventured farther, his flashlight sweeping the area. Shadows seemed to jump at him with every step, twisting and contorting into eerie shapes. Then he heard it, a soft whisper like someone breathing in his ear. Miles. He whipped around, his heart pounding. No one was there. It must have been his imagination, but then he heard it again, this time clearer. Miles. The voice was low, gravelly, and chillingly close, even though no one was there. He took a step back, heart racing, when he saw a figure standing among the trees, just on the edge of his flashlight beam. It was a man, or something that looked like one. He was unnaturally tall, with arms that seemed too long, fingers stretched into spindly claws. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes were hollow black pits, staring directly at Miles. Frozen in fear, Miles tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure tilted its head, an eerie smile spreading across its face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Then it whispered again, in that same gravelly voice, "Come closer, Miles." He stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the ground. His flashlight flew from his hand, landing a few feet away, casting erratic beams through the darkness. The figure took a step forward, moving in a strange, jerking motion like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Desperate, Miles scrambled to his feet and bolted toward his car. He could hear the thing's footsteps behind him, slow but steady, each step accompanied by a sickening, cracking sound, as if its bones were snapping with each movement. He reached his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the door handle. Finally, he yanked it open, throwing himself inside and locking the doors. He glanced into the rearview mirror, hoping, praying that the thing hadn't followed him. But it was already there. The creature was standing just outside his window, its face pressed against the glass, smiling that same awful toothy grin. Its eyes were hollow, dark, yet he could feel them boring into him. Paralyzed with fear, he couldn't tear his gaze away as it slowly raised a bony finger and tapped on the glass. Tap, 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 tap. In a moment of pure terror, Miles forced himself to start the car. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, slamming the gas pedal and speeding away. He watched in the rearview mirror as the figure grew smaller, standing motionless in the middle of the road, its black eyes watching him drive into the distance. Miles felt a brief moment of relief, but it was short-lived. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the radio was playing a soft static, one he hadn't noticed before. Then, through the static, he heard it, a faint whisper. Miles. Panicked, he reached for the dial, trying to turn the radio off, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. Miles, you can't run. The voice was clearer, closer, and suddenly he saw the figure's face in the rearview mirror, right in the back seat, grinning at him. He screamed, the car swerving as he struggled to control the wheel. The face vanished, but he could still feel its presence, as if it were lingering just out of sight. His heart pounded as he sped down the empty road, praying that he could make it home, that he could escape whatever that thing was. After what felt like an eternity, he saw the lights of his town ahead. He turned onto his street, breathing a sigh of relief as he pulled into his driveway. He sat there for a moment, his hands still clutching the wheel, trying to calm his racing heart. Finally, he convinced himself it was over, that he was safe. He got out of the car, casting one last look at the empty back seat before heading inside. As he closed the door behind him, he heard the faintest sound coming from the darkness outside. Miles. His blood ran cold, but he forced himself to ignore it. He was safe. He was home. He went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The image of the figure haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Just as he was drifting off, he heard a tap on his window. He sat up, heart pounding, staring into the darkness. Nothing moved. He told himself it was just his imagination, the lingering effects of his encounter on the road. But then, he heard it again, 3 soft taps on the glass. Slowly, he turned his head, and there, outside his bedroom window, was the figure, smiling that same awful, toothy grin. Miles, you can't run, you can't hide. With a final scream, the lights in his room flickered, and the last thing he saw was that terrible, grinning face as the darkness closed in around him. Driving at night was always peaceful for Alex. The long stretches of empty road, the cool air blowing through the cracked window, and the occasional flicker of passing headlights gave him a sense of calm. It was a quiet escape from his hectic life. Tonight, though, something felt different. He was driving on a road he had never taken before, a narrow, winding path through dense woods. The GPS had rerouted him due to construction, and despite its assurance that this was the quickest way home, Alex felt uneasy. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches arching over the road, blotting out the moonlight. The night was pitch black, and the only light came from his car's headlights, illuminating the narrow road ahead. The GPS screen dimmed, and then a notification flashed, "No signal." The map vanished, leaving only a blank screen. Alex glanced at his phone. No service. He was alone in the dark, unfamiliar stretch of road. As he continued driving, he noticed something odd up ahead. A figure was standing by the roadside, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her clothes disheveled, waving frantically for him to stop. Alex hesitated, slowing the car. She looked terrified, her face pale and drawn. Against his better judgment, he pulled over and rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Please," she gasped, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Help me. My car broke down and I've been stranded for hours." Alex scanned the area but didn't see any car, just the endless stretch of road and dark forest on either side. Something about the situation felt off, but he couldn't just leave her there. "Where's your car?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just a bit further up," she pointed, her hand shaking. "Please, I need to get home. It's not safe here." The way she said it sent a shiver down his spine. He unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in without hesitation, slamming it shut behind her. Her breathing was ragged, and she kept glancing nervously out the window. Alex started driving again, the silence in the car thick and uncomfortable. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light of the dashboard. Her clothes were dirty, torn in places as if she had been running through the woods. "What happened to your car?" he asked, trying to break the tension. "It just stopped," she muttered, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "I was driving, and it died. Then I heard them." "Heard who?" Alex's grip tightened on the wheel. "They're out there," she whispered. "Watching us. Following us." Alex felt a chill creep up his spine. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind them was empty. He wanted to ask more, but something in her tone stopped him. Instead, he focused on the road, pushing the car to go faster. Suddenly, the woman screamed. A blood-curdling, ear-piercing scream that made Alex's heart leap into his throat. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. He looked at her, eyes wide with shock. "What the hell?" he shouted. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide with terror. Slowly, Alex turned to see what she was looking at. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. It was shrouded in darkness, but he could make out the glint of eyes. Cold, lifeless eyes staring directly at them. "What is that?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. "They found us," the woman muttered. "We need to go. Now." Without thinking, Alex slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, but the figure didn't move. It stood there watching as they sped past. He kept driving, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glanced at the woman. She was muttering to herself, rocking back and forth. "Who are they?" he demanded. "They don't have a name," she said, her voice a shaky whisper. They live in the woods. They watch the roads at night. They wait for people, like us. The car suddenly sputtered, the engine choking as if it were being strangled. The dashboard lights flickered and the car slowed to a crawl. No, no, no. Alex muttered, pressing the gas pedal to the floor. But it was no use. The car rolled to a stop. In the silence that followed, he heard it. A faint rustling sound, like dry leaves being crunched underfoot. It was coming from all around them, from the woods, from the darkness. The woman whimpered, curling into herself. "They're here," she whispered. Alex frantically turned the key, trying to restart the car, but the engine just clicked uselessly. The rustling grew louder, closer. He could see movement in the trees, shadowy figures darting between the trunks. He reached for his phone, but there was still no signal. Suddenly, the passenger door flew open. The woman screamed as she was yanked out of the car by invisible hands, her nails scraping across the seat as she tried to hold on. Alex reached for her, but it was too late. She was dragged into the darkness, her screams fading into the night. He jumped out of the car, his flashlight in hand, and ran after her. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but he couldn't see her. Only the trees, the endless, suffocating trees. The rustling surrounded him now, circling him, the shadows moving closer. "Please," he shouted. "Let her go." But the only response was a low, guttural growl, followed by laughter, deep, inhuman laughter that echoed through the forest. He turned in circles, his flashlight flickering, the shadows pressing in. Then he saw them. Dozens of eyes staring at him from the darkness. They stepped into the light, figures tall and thin, their limbs twisted, their faces obscured by darkness. They surrounded him, cutting off any escape. He backed away slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Stay back," he shouted. But they moved closer, their eyes glinting with malice. He could feel their cold breath on his skin, hear their whispers, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. "You shouldn't have stopped," they whispered. "You shouldn't have looked." Suddenly his flashlight went out, plunging him into total darkness. He heard the woman's voice, faint and distant, screaming his name one last time before it was cut off. Then, silence. The next morning, a passing car found Alex's vehicle abandoned in the middle of the road, its doors hanging open. There was no sign of Alex or the woman he had picked up. The only clue was his phone, lying on the front seat, its screen cracked and flashing an error message, no signal. To this day, they say if you drive down that road at night, you can hear whispers in the wind, and sometimes if you're unlucky, you might see them standing in the trees, watching, waiting for their next victim. Jake was used to night drives. As a long-haul trucker, he often found himself alone on empty highways, surrounded by nothing but the darkness and the soft hum of his engine. The long stretches of road and the quiet nights didn't scare him anymore. But this drive was different. He was on a lonely stretch of highway cutting through the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest on either side. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving only the dim glow of his headlights piercing the darkness. The clock on his dashboard read 2:13 a.m. The route was unfamiliar. A detour had taken him off his usual path due to construction. He hadn't seen another car for over an hour, just an endless road lined with towering trees. As he turned a bend, his headlights caught something lying in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt. The tires screeched against the asphalt as he came to a stop just inches away from the object. It was a woman, sprawled out on the road, her hair covering her face. Jake's heart raced. He hesitated for a moment, considering the stories he had heard about highway ambushes where people pretend to be in distress to lure drivers out. But he couldn't just leave her there. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and cautiously stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at his skin. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet night. There was no response. He approached slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. As he got closer, he noticed that her clothes were torn and dirty, her arms covered in bruises. He crouched down, reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. The woman suddenly gasped, her eyes snapping open. She looked at him with pure terror, as if she had seen something unspeakable. "Please," she whispered, her voice weak and trembling. "Help me. They're coming." "Who's coming?" Jake asked, looking around, but there was nothing, only the darkness of the forest surrounding them. Before he could react, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Get me out of here!" she pleaded, her eyes wild with fear. Jake helped her to her feet and guided her to the truck. As soon as they were inside, he locked the doors and started the engine. The woman was shaking, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone or something to appear out of the darkness. "Who are you running from?" Jake asked as he pulled back onto the road, driving faster than he usually would. "They live in the woods," she whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused. "They watch the road at night, looking for people. I tried to escape, but they've been following me." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He had heard urban legends about haunted highways and strange creatures lurking in the woods, but he had always dismissed them as just stories. As they drove, the woman kept glancing at the side mirror, her face pale and strained. Jake tried to calm her down, but nothing seemed to help. The tension in the truck was thick, the air cold despite the heater blasting. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life, filling the cab with static. Jake glanced at it, frowning. He hadn't touched the radio. Through the static, he could make out a faint whispering, almost like voices, though he couldn't understand what they were saying. "What is that?" he muttered, reaching to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The static grew louder, the whispers more distinct. It sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once, overlapping in a chilling chorus. The woman suddenly screamed, pointing at the windshield. "There! Look!" Jake's eyes snapped to the road ahead. At first he saw nothing, just the dark stretch of asphalt and the trees. But then he saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the road, barely visible in the darkness. They were tall and thin, their limbs long and twisted, their faces obscured by shadow. He swerved to avoid them, the truck veering dangerously close to the edge of the road. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He kept his eyes on the road, refusing to look back at the figures as they passed. "What the hell were those?" he gasped, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They're the Watchers," the woman whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They come out at night to hunt." The radio static suddenly stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growling that filled the truck. It was a sound unlike anything Jake had ever heard, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to vibrate through the entire cab. The headlights flickered, casting the road in a strobe of light and shadow. He pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the truck roaring down the highway at breakneck speed. He didn't care about the speed limit. He just needed to get away from whatever those things were. Suddenly, the woman let out a choked gasp. "They're here." Jake glanced in the rearview mirror. His blood ran cold. The road behind them was no longer empty. Figures were running behind the truck, like their movements unnatural and jerky, as if they were being pulled along by invisible strings. They were fast, impossibly fast, keeping up with the truck even as he sped down the highway. One of the figures leapt onto the back of the truck, its hands slamming against the rear window. Jake could see its face now, pale and distorted, its eyes wide and unblinking. It stared at him, its mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. The woman screamed, covering her ears. "Don't look at them! Just drive!" Jake tore his eyes away, focusing on the road. He could feel the truck shuddering as the figures clung to it, their nails scraping against the metal. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The truck stopped shuddering, the growling noise faded, and the road was empty again. The radio crackled one last time before going silent. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the woman's ragged breathing. Jake slowed down, his hands shaking as he pulled over to the side of the road. He turned to the woman, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she had never been there. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty seat, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion? He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was still 2:13 a.m., the same time it had been when he first stopped for her. He checked his phone. No calls, no messages. It was as if time had frozen during that entire encounter. With a shaky breath, he put the truck in gear and continued driving. He didn't stop until he reached a gas station miles down the road. When he got out, he noticed deep scratches on the back of the truck, as if something with claws had clung to it. To this day, Jake refuses to take that route again, and whenever he drives at night, he can't shake the feeling that he's being watched from the shadows, that the Watchers are still out there, waiting for their next victim. Kyle hated driving at night, but tonight he had no choice. He was traveling through a rural back road to get home after visiting his parents. The shortcut saved him nearly an hour, but it was always unsettling, surrounded by thick woods on both sides and barely any streetlights. It was the kind of road where the darkness felt alive, like it was pressing in on the car. The clock read 12:34 a.m., and Kyle's headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating the road ahead. He rolled down the window slightly to keep himself alert with the cold air biting at his face. He turned up the radio, filling the silence with the soft strumming of a country song. As he drove, he saw something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, her pale dress fluttering slightly in the breeze. She seemed out of place, miles away from any town or house. Kyle's heart raced as he got closer. He slowed down, his headlights revealing her face. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair. Her eyes, however, were wide and filled with fear. Kyle hesitated. His first instinct was to drive past. He had heard enough horror stories to know better than to stop for strangers at night. But as he passed her, she reached out and her lips moved, though he couldn't hear what she was saying. "Do you need help?" he shouted, leaning out the window, his foot still hovering over the gas pedal. "Please, they're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the car engine. Kyle's gut twisted. The look in her eyes was one of genuine terror. He glanced around, but the road was empty. No cars, no movement, just the dark forest. Against his better judgment, he put the car in park and stepped out. "Who's coming?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Before she could answer, a deep, guttural growl echoed from the woods. It was low and rumbling, like an animal's snarl, but deeper, more menacing. The woman's eyes widened and she grabbed his arm. "We have to go now," she cried. Without thinking, Kyle pulled her toward his car. They both jumped in and he slammed on the gas, the tires squealing as they sped off. He looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see whatever had made that noise, but the road was still empty. He glanced at the woman, who was trembling in the passenger seat, her eyes darting frantically. "What was that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "They come out at night," she whispered, hugging herself. "They watch the roads, looking for someone to take." Kyle's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to ask more, but the words got stuck in his throat. The radio crackled, cutting through the tense silence with a burst of static before a low voice spoke, distorted and garbled. It sounded like whispering, but Kyle couldn't make out any words. The woman's head snapped toward the radio, her face going pale. "They know we're here," she said, her voice trembling. "They can sense us." Kyle felt a chill run down his spine. He turned the radio off, but the whispers continued, growing louder. He turned the dial, trying to find a station, but it was just static and that unsettling whispering. It sounded like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, the car jolted as if something had hit it from behind. Kyle nearly lost control, swerving to keep the car on the road. He looked in the rearview mirror again, and this time he saw it. Something tall and thin, running on all fours, keeping pace with the car. Its limbs were long and twisted, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. "Faster!" the woman screamed, clutching the dashboard. "You have to go faster!" Kyle slammed his foot on the gas pedal, the engine roaring as they sped down the road. The creature kept pace, its eyes never leaving the car. It moved unnaturally like a puppet on strings, its limbs bending at impossible angles. The whispers on the radio grew louder, almost deafening, as if the voices were inside the car now. Just as Kyle thought he couldn't push the car any harder, the creature lunged at them. There was a loud thud as it hit the back of the car, and Kyle felt the vehicle shudder. He swerved, trying to shake it off, but it clung to the trunk, its claws scraping against the metal. He could hear it now, a hissing, growling noise like a wild animal mixed with a deep, guttural laugh. The woman screamed, covering her ears, tears streaming down her face. "They want us! They want our souls!" Desperation surged through Kyle. He spotted a narrow dirt road up ahead and made a split-second decision. He swerved onto it, the car bouncing and jolting as it sped down the uneven path. The creature's grip slipped and it tumbled off into the darkness. He didn't stop. He drove as fast as he could, the car rattling over the rough road until he saw a light up ahead. It was an old, dilapidated gas station, its neon sign flickering in the night. He pulled into the lot, skidding to a stop. The woman jumped out before he could say a word, running toward the building. Kyle followed her, his legs feeling like jelly. He burst through the door to find the woman speaking frantically to an old man behind the counter. The man looked up, his face grave. You saw them, didn't you? Kyle nodded, breathless. What were those things? The old man shook his head slowly. They've been here longer than the road itself. They feed on fear, on the souls of those who wander too close at night. He glanced at the woman, who was still trembling. You were lucky to make it here. Kyle turned to the woman, but she was gone. He spun around, looking out the window. The lot was empty, no sign of her anywhere. He turned back to the old man, confused. Where did she go? The old man looked at him sadly. Son, you came in here alone. Kyle's blood ran cold. He staggered back, shaking his head. No, she was just here. I picked her up on the road. That road's been closed for years, the old man interrupted. No one's driven it in ages, not since the last disappearance. Kyle felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He stumbled back to his car, his mind racing. The back of the car was scratched, deep gouges in the metal. He glanced at the passenger seat, and his heart nearly stopped. There, lying on the seat, was a single white dress stained with dirt and blood. He threw it out of the car and sped off, not daring to look back. Even now, Kyle refuses to take back roads at night. He still hears whispers on his radio sometimes, even when it's off, as if they're reminding him that he narrowly escaped the fate they had planned for him.